So I'm wondering if we could go a little bit through the history of porn work,
Sure.
because I think one, look, I'm. This is a silly thing to say, but I became fascinated by this by watching The Deuce, which
Yeah,
kind of goes through it,
sure.
which is a great show if people want to check that out. But you know, the it begins really in the 1970s, the golden age of pornography, where you have these big theatrical releases like Deep Throat.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the dynamics change really rapidly. If you don't
Mhm.
mind taking us through that history.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll try to give you the quick and dirty version, which is to say that the kind of, I think one common narrative is that there was this golden age of porn that the Deuce touches on, but also I think rightfully shows that making loops in the 70s didn't look that much different from making one-off scenes for Gonzo Productions in the 2010s. What changes is not, and this is where I think that common narrative goes wrong, is this sense that porn used to be filmic, that it was like mostly films like The Devil and Miss Jones or Deep Throat, that it used to be real acting and then that changed over time. But in reality, since the advent of porn on film, most productions have been low budget. Most performers have been pretty low paid. What's changed hugely, though, and moves alongside shifts in technology and access to distribution, is the cost of production and thus also the availability of self production for everyday performers. So, what you see in the dues is that even though production is pretty low budget, it is in some ways exclusive to people who can afford the camera equipment and have access to often mob affiliated distribution networks, and all of this. And so we see just this progressive erosion of that kind of monopoly as technology gets democratized in a sense. So video in the 1980s is cheaper, somewhat more accessible, but people are still subject to kind of calcified distribution networks. And that gave kind of old school production studios and producers like a lot of power to determine the conditions of work, that maintains through much of the DVD era. But now, in the age of OnlyFans, anyone can produce and distribute their own content, and that has had a huge change for what that means for working conditions. So that's my quick version.
I mean, I'm hoping, if you don't mind, if
Yeah,
we can dive into it even more.
cool.
Just because when video becomes the thing in the
Yeah.
1980s, how did that affect the labor dynamics? Like, how did that affect pay
Mhm,
for workers? And
mhm.
this is both performers, people behind the scenes as well, production crew, and
Yeah,
also HIV/AIDS comes to the
right.
fore during that time. What happened in the 80s that then we can transition to the 90s.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so what this means, the first to your first question, what this means for pay and working conditions, as profits just soared during this time, the availability of at-home video viewing absolutely changed the market, and this at the same time as video became cheaper to produce than film in the 1970s, and so studios stood to make a lot more money, as and we don't have to get into like the minutia of the law, but as obscenity charges become less and less likely, it becomes less important to have mob affiliations in order to ensure safe distribution. So in some ways, the business becomes corporatized, and a bit more above ground. Um, with the kind of explosion of profit and production, gonzo or kind of one off scenes become more ubiquitous, and we see less investment in like an hour and a half film, something like Devil and Miss Jones. And so, for working conditions, that has some contradictory effects. More work is available, particularly to people who weren't plugged into the old kind of social networks that made possible the kind of social world that you're describing in The Deuce, for example. But the work in some ways becomes more intensive. There's less, it's true that in a lot of those films, there is less acting, there is more hardcore sex. Which some people prefer. Some people found the acting tedious and found the more hardcore scenes more fun to shoot. But it's harder on it becomes harder on your body, and people tend to do more scenes in the space of a week, things like that, rather than shooting for 2 weeks at a time. So you can stand to make a lot more money in any given work week in this moment, but the conditions of work intensify in some other ways. And then, yeah, in terms
And
of
I'm sorry to
yeah,
cut in really quickly, but
sure.
the hardcore scenes, I think, is kind of where, correct me if I'm wrong, some of the feminists in that time became anti-porn and a little bit more pro-censorship, as opposed to maybe, I think, more updated intersectional thought in the current climate, where I think, feminist scholarship has evolved beyond that.
In some ways,
Or,
there's a
or I'm
huge.
hopeful.
Yeah, there's the anti-porn feminist movement right now is hugely powerful. It has in many ways come to understand that fighting around obscenity is not a winning strategy, both legally and because it has less cultural cachet. But you can see the power of anti-porn feminism, including in the kind of old ways that we're now used to these somewhat counterintuitive allegiances with the Christian right around manufactured panics over porn as a public health crisis, particularly for teenage boys. That absolutely has not waned. I think that's only increased, as well as anti-porn and anti-sex worker lobbying that comes in under cover of fake concern over trafficking. So both of those things have increased, I think, dramatically.
And then we move to the mid '90s, and then we
Sure.
have digital porn, and that
Right.
must be a complete shock to the industry. You have piracy sites that are putting up this content for free. It's the wild, wild west, and
Yeah.
workers bear the brunt of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get there, I do want to answer your question about the role of HIV/AIDS in the late
Oh yes.
1980s. And so what I'll say about that, and in some ways it's linked to my answer about digital, is that yes, a lot of these shifts come as a shock to the industry, but also that people in the industry and sex workers more broadly have often been at the forefront of movements to meet the challenges of, in this case, like a public health crisis. And it was porn workers themselves who developed testing standards that helped keep each other safe, in ways that were far more advanced than a lot of other sectors of the population, who were confronting the virus. So that's one piece there. You also have at the same around the same moment the invention of Viagra, and that changes to the kind of labor market for who can plausibly perform in a scene. But yeah,
And
we can get to the digital if you're ready.
yeah, yeah, I am. I'm just curious about that time period
Yeah.
because, um, as I say, it's the wild, wild west. There is, it explodes exploitation to a degree because of, and I mean that in terms of like just strictly labor exploitation,
Mhm.
because people are accessing all of this content and watching porn without the commensurate compensation for the
Yeah.
workers involved, and um, based on just cultural attitudes about porn and wanting it to be seen but only consumed and not reckoned with as an industry in and of itself, I
Mhm.
think that would increase the volatility of the labor dynamics, because basically people that there's no effort at any kind of regulation or sunlight on some of these practices.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing I'll say about the piracy piece, um, is that because there was no structure in place for porn performers to get residuals for films,
Mm.
and they were required to sign modeling releases that gave producers complete control over what happened to a scene after it was shot. So you would get paid once a day rate for a scene, and then a studio could chop that up a dozen ways. So you can see this if you look on porn's version of IMDb, for example. It'll look as though someone has filmed like 20,000 scenes in the 90s. And that's people who filmed a lot, but it's more so that their scenes for which they were paid just once and never received royalties got chopped up a million different ways, resold, rebranded under different DVD names. So that's all to say, yeah, piracy was a crisis for the industry, but it hit of course, it hit the people who were making more money off of scenes more than it hit performers who were paid a day rate anyway. So there are some performers from that time who talked to me about, yeah, how violating piracy felt to them to know that their content was being distributed without any compensation. And then there are others who said, this was already true. Like it's the question of whether producers are doing it or some guy on what would come to be Pornhub.
And then we move kind of to the current era where there is a benefit to the fact that performers can perform in the safety of their own home.
Right.
There's subscription services, OnlyFans, but then you're at the whim of the algorithm, as we mentioned earlier.
Mhm.
What has that meant for the labor dynamics at play?
Yeah. I mean, so to be at the whim of the algorithm, and I will say OnlyFans doesn't work under an algorithmic model, and I won't get into like the specificity of the tech there, but that's just the note that the setup is a bit different. It instead requires a ton of self marketing from performers to bring people to their particular pages, which means that they're at the whim of all sorts of other algorithms, whether that be Twitter or whatever. But there are all sorts of ways that this kind of digital management acts on people's working conditions. In particular, the fact that platforms like OnlyFans don't really offer anything. In some ways, it's like even less of a service to workers than Uber, which is also enacting control through its monopoly in all sorts of ways. But that's to say, like OnlyFans takes a huge cut in exchange for pretty nominal interference between workers and consumers. But the reason that performers have to use these platforms in the first place is because of anti-sex worker policy, which makes it impossible for them to use mainstream platforms to distribute. And so that's one piece of the puzzle.